Hello everyone, I'm Simon from Stampix and welcome to Loyalty Expert Talks. Today it's my pleasure to introduce Ian Golding. Ian is the founder of Customer Experience Consultancy, and with over 25 years of experience across a variety of industries, Ian can be considered a seasoned and certified customer experience professional. Ian, welcome on this beautiful day. How are you doing?
I'm very good, thank you, Simon. It's a real pleasure to be here with you today.
Great to hear. So Ian, we ask this to every expert before we dive into the questions. And so the goal here is to present yourself or introduce yourself short in just 1 minute and try to stay within one minute. It's not easy, but I'm ready when you are.
Let's do it. So, Ian Golding, customer experience professional, as you said. Some people think I make up that job title, but it is a real one. I've been doing this for a long time. Started actually in process improvement. I'm a Lean Six Sigma Master Black Belt, amongst other things, but spent 17 years on the inside of corporate organizations before becoming independent 9 years ago. So over the last 9 years, I've been in 44 countries around the world. Every continent apart from Antarctica, which is unlikely to change anytime soon. This is really my vocation, not just my job, but helping organizations understand how to make customer experience practical and actionable is what I'm all about. Will
Great.
that do? That's probably less than a minute, but
It's even less than a minute. Great introduction. And very impressive, 44 countries. I bet you're missing the travel right now.
Well, do you know, it's a very interesting question. Yes and no. The interesting thing about not traveling is that I've actually been in even more countries than that, because the lack of travel has made me even more accessible. So I'm now interacting with people that wouldn't have been able to either afford to get me to go there or to afford to come to one of the things that I do. So, the world has become a smaller place. Am I missing airports? Absolutely not. So am I missing warm weather? Yes, but that's one of the downsides of being marooned during lockdown in the UK.
Yeah, same thing here in Belgium, as you can imagine. All right, so the next question is a little bit more personal. So we're curious to learn if there's a particular brand or a product that you are loyal to yourself in your personal life. And if so, would you say that this loyalty is driven by rational economics, or is it one driven by emotions?
Very interesting question. I love the question. And I'm going to be cheeky and mention two, okay, if that's okay. But there's a reason why. When you think about, are you loyal to companies? We think, are we loyal to the product, or are we loyal because it's the whole experience that they're delivering to me? And the business, if I can even call it that I am most loyal to is a restaurant, a local restaurant to me. I live in Chester in the northwest of England, and it's an Italian restaurant called La Fattoria.
Right.
And the reason that I'm loyal to that particular business is that me and my family have been going there for 15 years. My son was probably brought up on their food, breast milk and La Fattoria meals, and what's remarkable about them is that you can never get a seat at this restaurant ever. I mean, it's almost impossible. You've got to book ahead. However, if you've been going there for 15 years, they know who we are. In fact, they know almost everyone that walks into that restaurant. They introduce themselves by name. They know what your name is. And if you haven't booked a table, it doesn't matter. They will find somewhere for you to sit. It's really quite remarkable. And they're not expensive. They haven't really changed their prices over the years. So is that driven by economics or emotion? It's actually, the money's irrelevant. It is entirely emotional. Where the economics comes in, so the total converse of that is my other one, and it won't surprise you to hear me say that it's Amazon. Because am I loyal to Amazon emotionally? No. Now, ironically, saying that, Jeff Bezos is my man crush. I think what he's created is quite remarkable. What is very, very clever about the whole Amazon model, and why, to me, I am a loyal customer, is because they have made my life so easy. That they sell everything. And in fact, if I need anything, I don't search on Google for what I want. I search on Amazon for what I want. You know, they've become a search engine in their own right. And that enables me to manage the economics because I can find things of the value that I need. But also, if I need it, I know that they're going to get it to me very quickly. It's incredibly easy. Even if I've forgotten my credit card details, it's just so easy. So one is just easy. The other, it is entirely led by the heart. But I hope that answers the question effectively.
Perfect answer for each of the situations. And I guess in many situations, it's a combination of both, where we are emotionally triggered, and then there's the rationalization when we see the deal.
Indeed.
But
Indeed.
thanks so much. Great examples. So acknowledging that you work with some of the largest brands, what do you see as their biggest challenges nowadays in terms of customer loyalty?
So I think there are probably too many to mention in the time that we've got available. But I think, unfortunately, it connects to a number of fundamental issues that are really sending shockwaves through most legacy industries. The shockwave being that historically, organizations created themselves to differentiate on their products and services. You know, and so that's why I know that many people say to you that they're loyal to Apple, but you know, they're actually loyal to the products because you know they love the products. They look nice. They are nice. You know, I've got an iPhone. I don't have other Apple technology, but are they loyal to the experience is a different question altogether. And I think part of the problem is that we are a very capitalist society globally. And the problem is that most organizations have convinced themselves that the reason they exist is to make money. You know, and as a result, they have increasingly become more and more sales led, not customer led, but sales led. We need to shift more. How do we sell more? The problem is that as they've done that, they've become more and more disconnected from who they're actually selling that stuff to and why they're selling it to them in the first place. And so we've unfortunately ended up in an environment with a huge lack of empathy. There's a huge lack of true understanding of who the customer is. You know, being from the UK, one of the greatest examples of the management of loyalty was Tesco. You know, when they launched the Tesco Club Card, I mean, it was revolutionary. You know, finally, this company, they know what I buy. They understand what I buy. And, you know, they come to me and suggest things to me and it feels so personal, you know, but that's all gone. You know, over time, the rewards you get from that card have got smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. It's a data exercise. Do they care about me as a human? And so I think, unfortunately, that need to shift from being product led to being customer led is proving to be a massive challenge. Because if you want to differentiate yourself, it has become increasingly difficult, if not impossible, to differentiate on the product or service itself. Because unless your product is completely unique, you know, it's very difficult to do that. If you want to differentiate in 2021 and beyond, you have to go beyond the product and differentiate the whole experience. However, the final thing I shall say, if you look at the most customer-centric organizations on the planet, where the Amazons of the world sit inside, the overwhelming majority of them were created that way. Okay. The problem is, how do you transform a legacy business that wasn't created that way to get there? And the major reason why it doesn't happen is because that transformation is very, very difficult and it is a long-term strategy. And unfortunately, corporate organizations do not think long-term. They are far too short-term focused and they cannot sustain what's required to get there.
Makes a lot of sense. And it reminds me, in fact, of a quote that you're probably familiar with, which is that experience is the new product and time is the new price, right?
Yes.
So it's actually that shift from legacy.
100%. But it requires courage. You know, we're talking about changing the traditional business model. You know, we are, I, among other companies, used to work for GE. General Electric, and I'm old enough to have worked at GE when Jack Welch was still the CEO. And Jack Welch's mantra strategically was something called find, win, keep. And what it meant was, strategically, our objective is to find new customers, win their business, and then keep them for as long as possible.
Mm-hmm.
The problem that Jack Welch identified very early on is that we're not doing that. What we're doing is front loading our strategy to the find and win.
Mm-hmm.
We're not worrying about the keep. And actually, we see customer services that's their job, but it isn't. The customer experience is about all three of those things. And so it's why, sadly, legacy businesses still have that very leaky funnel. They throw loads of stuff into it, but it just all pours out the bottom because they don't understand what is required to manage the ongoing relationship so you do maintain that loyalty.
Yeah, one hell of a challenge. And talking about challenges, back in 2018, you wrote a book called Customer What? The Honest and Practical Guide to Customer Experience. Can you elaborate a bit on why you wrote the book and why today it's more relevant than ever? I think part of it you already covered, but
it's a very good question. Why did I write it? Maybe because I'm slightly mad. I don't know. When I went independent in 2012, one of the first things someone said to me is, Ian, you need to write about customer experience, because when you're an employee on the inside, you don't often share your perspectives publicly. And 9 years ago is a long time ago. It was a very different world then, and so I wrote about it. And I quite liked it. And so I wrote again, and I wrote again, and I wrote again. And 600 articles later, I thought, I love doing this. People like hearing what I've got to say. And it was inevitable, really, that I would end up sort of pulling all of my thoughts together into a book, because I am very, very passionate about helping people, supporting people, guiding people to not just theorize about customer experience, but to turn the theory into practice. And so what I wanted to create was something that gave people that very honest but realistic view as to how to do that. And I didn't want it to feel like a normal book. So it's not like a book just with text. It's very visual. It's very, there's lots of images in it and everything else. But it's almost like a guide that if you need help, then reach out to it. And what makes me constantly feel so positive about what I did is that to this day, I get people messaging me saying, do you know what, Ian, whenever I'm feeling, that we're not going in the right direction, I just pick up your book, read a chapter, and it reminds me again that we're doing the right thing. And that for me makes the challenge of creating a book, especially as a self-publisher, which I was. So I saw the other side of Amazon as a supplier, which is not as nice. It made that hard work and effort absolutely worthwhile.
Great. Yeah, I was about to say it, that having given Amazon as one of the examples in the earlier question, there's no surprise that your book is available on Amazon.
Well, it is, but trust me, it was difficult. And what that demonstrates is that whilst I said that Amazon are a great example, even Amazon haven't made it. You've never finished. And I deliver customer experience masterclasses around the world, and I very often have senior leaders from Amazon attend my classes, which just goes to show that they know that they can never stop learning. And these people come because they want to know, what do we not know? What are we not doing? And that's another secret to their success, actually.
Yeah, great. So when you're talking to these leaders from across the world and across various sectors, which metrics do you consider vital when you're talking about loyalty and loyalty programs? Maybe also a sub question is about NPS. Where does that fit in?
Yeah.
Area.
It's a really interesting question. I think, historically, people would have looked at retention, standard retention metrics of, how well are we keeping customers? I'll never forget I spent 7 years working for an online retailer. And it's one of the reasons why I became quite immersed in what Tesco were doing, because all retailers were thinking, how can we replicate that? And what was very interesting is that at that time, my retailer defined who was a customer. Okay, and that definition was related to the length of time that they'd been shopping with us, and the gap between the last purchase and the current date. So if they didn't place an order within 6 months, they were no longer considered to be a customer. And you know, I thought, that's madness. What do you mean? You know, and they said, well, they're not a customer anymore. I said, well, surely that's for them to decide, you know, if they're a customer or not. So I think, again, it just highlights that there is, I think we become so obsessed with numbers, we forget, well, why are we measuring the number in the first place? You know, and when you then take that to metrics like NPS, you know, many are misinterpreting NPS entirely. You know, now that there are so many issues with this that it would take me too long to go through all of them, but most organizations in the world are actually measuring NPS incorrectly anyway. And they're drawing the wrong conclusion from the way they're measuring it. But NPS is an indicative measure. You know, it is a statement of intent. It doesn't mean that you actually do it. And in fact, just because you recommend someone doesn't mean you're loyal to them. And, you know, there are so many misunderstandings about it. And so I think, do we need to see retention as the most accurate indicator of loyalty? Well, it is definitely one of the most accurate. But voice of the customer metrics will enable you to understand why that's happening. Okay, so it's almost like an input measure for loyalty. It shouldn't be seen as the outcome measure, because it isn't. You know, just because I'm satisfied doesn't mean I'm going to buy again. That doesn't mean I'm loyal. You know, so I think we need to be able to merge business metrics more effectively with customer metrics. And so, in answer to your question, when I talk about customer experience measurement, it is, in my opinion, the most important competency of all. And there are 3 voices of measurement that organizations should be understanding. The first is voice of the customer, which most are aware of. The second is voice of the employee. Now, voice of the employee is not employee engagement, but it's about understanding employee perception of the experience. Because if your employees think that what you do is rubbish, then it will give you a very good indication as to what your customers will think. But the third voice is the most important of the 3, ironically, but it's the least commonly measured of all. And that's something I call voice of the process. This is about having a measurable understanding of the relationship between what we do, our processes, and the way our customer feels about it in the journey. And by understanding that relationship, you're understanding the marriage between cause and effect, why my customer feels the way they feel. And that helps you to drive continuous improvement to the journey. But there is a 4th voice, the 4th voice being voice of the business. So what we need to recognize is that the way we measure the customer experience, we must then be able to align that to the metrics that the business is interested in, such as retention, so we can see why those numbers are going in the direction that they are. But what I'm describing is very, very rare to see on the inside of organizations. The immaturity when it comes to measurement is really quite stark.
Yeah, I can imagine. And I personally, I had heard of the voice of the customer, of course, but having the other voices in there and sort of imagining how they fit together in a framework is a really interesting concept. And is that something that's also highlighted in your book?
I do talk about it in my book, absolutely. And anyone that ever wants to hear me rambling in more detail may want to attend one of my masterclasses, and then they can find out even more.
Excellent, excellent. Exciting. And although I feel that there's so much more ground to cover, unfortunately, we're already nearing the end of the interview. But before we check out, I have one last question. According to you, is there anyone else in the industry or a book that you would recommend for people interested in customer experience, loyalty, retention that we can't miss out?
So there's lots of noise out there, should I say. But I think, in my view, there is a book and there is a person who I think that everyone who is interested in this field whether it be specifically loyalty or the broader customer experience arena. I think one of the best books written is Outside In, written by Kerry Bodine. I think most customer experience professionals will have that on their bookshelf. But I think the person who I still think is brilliant, and they are a constant reminder to me of the need to just have simple clarity with all of this, is Simon Sinek. Simon Sinek is, I think, brilliant. And I always said that I hope one day people talk about me in the same way they talk about him. But what I love is that nothing he says is rocket science, and that's sort of a very important principle that aligns to what I do. But he says it in a way that really gets people to stop and think. And, to this day, every time I teach, I will talk about his golden circle, and it's timeless, and it's been there for a long time, but it's amazing how companies forget it. And so, we need to look up to people like Simon as, people that they are talking so much sense, but that sense disappears when we get bogged down with complexity, numbers, and just the day-to-day obsession with tasks.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. Also a big fan of Simon Sinek, and start with the why.
Absolutely.
Thanks so much, Ian, for spending the time today. I'm a big fan of your work and look forward to reading your book.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Well, thank you so much for asking me, Simon.
Great.